Good morning, everyone. My name is Joy Wilkins. I do serve as a facilitator for MAX, the Metro Atlanta Exchange for Workforce Solutions. We're super excited to be with you this morning. Really glad that you were able to join us. We are here with Jim Skinner with the Atlanta Regional Commission. And Jim is going to introduce us to the Metro Atlanta Speaks survey and share the results from the last year. I can just tell you, you are in for a real treat. I've heard Jim speak on this a couple of times, and all I can say is I want to hear Jim speak more. So you're in for a real treat. But first, without further ado, I do want to say thank you to the anchor investors for Max. Without these anchor investors, our work just simply would not be possible. So that includes Workforce Georgia, the Georgia Department of Human Services, Workforce Metro Atlanta, CareerWise, the Goodwill of North Georgia, Metro Atlanta Chamber, BDI, First Step Staffing, and Georgia Express Links Partners. So if you know anyone with these organizations, please definitely thank them for all they do to serve our workforce community. Um, my name is Joy Wilkins. If we don't know each other, I serve as your facilitator for MAX. Jim Skinner is the Data Analysis Administrator with the Research and Analytics Division at the Atlanta Regional Commission, a real veteran when it comes to looking at data and helping us understand what it means. And so, without further ado, we will go ahead and turn over to you, Jim. And then for those of you joining us as you're listening to Jim, if you have any questions, please feel free to either post them in the chat or in the Q&A function through Zoom. So we look forward to the next several minutes with you. Thank you for joining us.
All righty. Joy, can you see the slides?
Yes, you're all good, Jim.
Very good. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Good to be with y'all today to talk about something obviously near and dear to my heart. I've been the project manager of this very large survey, which has ranged from 4,000 to 5,000 respondees over its 11 years. I've been the project manager for it from the beginning. It's one of the biggest surveys in the Southeast. It's one of, this is sort of our Federal Reserve slide, by the way, y'all. This is our mission put in slide form. This survey is one of the major ways that ARC reaches out and captures opinions of diverse stakeholders, because we all know that public engagement and that gathering the viewpoints of diverse stakeholders through public engagement is hit or miss. This is one of the ways that we get a representation of some groups that rarely attend our public meetings and don't get to insert their opinions into our regional planning efforts as clearly as some others that make themselves more visible. And it is a strategic investment in getting more data to drive decisions. So again, I mentioned the 11th year of the survey. We skipped 2022 because it was a budgetary issue as well as an issue of communicating the value of this to our new leadership at the time. The inspiration for this came from one of our leadership trips, which have been going on for about 15 plus years now. We were exposed on a Houston trip to a survey called I forget, was it the Houston Area Survey is exactly what it was called. And it's been going on for about 25 years, much smaller regional survey, but it tried to capture attitudes and perceptions of a regionally significant sample. We took it as a model for the Atlanta area, brought it over here, started smaller with a regional significance or regional representative sample, but we've expanded it over the year to get county level representation and significant results. We started off with of a very stable longitudinal set of questions. But some interesting things have happened since we started this survey in 2013, COVID for one, and we had to switch out a number of the questions to capture the topics of the day. Also, affordable housing really came to the fore in the last couple of years, and we had to insert questions on that topic that we didn't originally have. We've always maintained, however, pretty consistent demographic crosstabs, and that gives the richness of some of the results that you'll see here today. It's not just an answer that we can put some oomph behind for the region as a whole or for counties as a whole. We get to look at, particularly for the region, the splits by age, the splits by income, the splits by race, splits even down to employment status. So that gives it its true value, at least in my book. And we've had to move from initially a phone survey, and some of you probably know this before I say it, to a cheaper and more effective hybrid method of phone plus online surveying because of cost and because of reach, because of getting a representative reach. Few of us answer. Few of us have a landline. We started with landline surveys. Then we expanded that to cell phones, but few of us really answer an unknown cell phone number. So to get a sample at a reasonable cost, we had to go to a hybrid model. So let's look at some of the results, the main results this year. Not too surprisingly, the economy was the answer to our question that always gets the most traction, which is what is the biggest problem that you, the respondents, see for the region? And we've offered a consistent set of responses to that question over time. And the economy, which had dropped off pretty dramatically as we came out of the Great Recession, rose to the top as the biggest problem. As you see in later slides, it tripled its significance, tripled the share of people that saw it that way. People felt they're much worse off this year than they were last year. This year being 2024 compared to 2023. We'll look at some crosstabs for that. Jobs were hard to find for a large segment, certainly a plurality of our population. But it's interesting to see where the perception was that those jobs were harder to find. That's kind of surprising where you'll see people say jobs were harder to find. And I'd urge you to, take emphasis from those results because we see that split in a number of the questions we're going to look at. A surprising split between suburbs and core in terms of the responses to questions. And one comment here, the issues that I pop up here in red, we're going to look at further slides to sort of add some richness to the opinions. We're going to pass over some of these items that I'm listing in black here for the interest of time, but just know that there's information available to dig deeper on those topics as well. What this says is about emergency costs, gives a current look at a question we've asked for about 5 years now, and that's the ability to afford a $400 emergency expense. And it didn't get worse this past year, but it's a low bar because only 50% of us can afford that $400 emergency expense with a cash or debit payment. We have to go to credit, not pay it at all for the other 50%. Housing affordability, we started asking this question 3 years ago. It's a bit worse, just a bit worse this year in 2024 than it was in 2023. But it's from a very low bar. Most of us feel that we would not be able to move in our own neighborhood. And that's not getting any better, obviously, as the numbers, as we all know, are not getting any better as far as price trends and rent trends really outstripping wage growth and limited availability of new housing. Taxes for infrastructure. We asked for the first time this year about whether you'd pay extra on your water bill to allow for improvement of the system. And we asked again about whether or not you would pay for expanding the public transit system, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And we got a pretty resounding no about that, and a more resounding no than we'd gotten in past years. Transportation is one of the issues that, for most of the years we've administered this survey, has been the number one issue. That's dropped off dramatically since the pandemic, for an obvious reason during the pandemic, but hasn't really risen back much towards the top since then. There's been no increase in a perceived lack of transportation by people, although there is a lack of transportation in predictable areas. And as I mentioned before, transit, we still feel perceptually and conceptually like it's really, really important to the region, but we don't want to pay for it and we don't want to pay for more of it because we often don't use it. We've all seen the numbers in the media that show decreasing shares of people using that alternate mode in our region. Emerging tech, we're not going to dwell on these particular issues other than AI. AI is much more relevant to the workforce community, much more relevant to the respondents' perception about the health of the job market. We have a few questions on EVs and climate change. And I just said EVs and climate change. And that's something that's not exactly welcomed in terms of the verbiage and the description of particular perceptions there. But I will mention that EVs did not gain in our survey an increasing share of ownership. And global and regional climate change in this survey administered in August of last year, we did not get much of an increase in people's awareness of the significance of those issues at the global and regional level. And yet we did not get much of a decline either. But again, these results were from August of 2024. The future, that's a question that we also get a lot of media interest in. Who thinks things are going to be better in the next 3 to 4 years, as of 2024 than they did in 2023? And we found an encouraging trend there, but only slightly, in that a larger share in 2024 thought better in the near short-term future than they did in 2023. And this typical spatial pattern that you'll note with a lot of questions, where poorer areas, where areas with a less healthy job market, where people with more struggle accessing adequate transportation were more optimistic than people that lived in higher income areas, areas with lower crime, areas with a larger number of sociological data-based advantages were less optimistic. So let's move on to, and we also deal with these two questions that are kind of in the news lately. Let's move on to some details about how things changed with the biggest problem and those other issues I just went over. The economy, as I mentioned earlier, in 2021, that's the blue bar, it had roughly a third the share of people saying it was the biggest problem than it did in the most recent survey period of 2024. You see up there at the top, transportation, even between 21 and 24 at a fairly low level. Crime was number one in 2021, but with the rise of concern about the economy and with factually drops in the crime rate after the instability of the pandemic, it dropped all the way to 20%, but it's still second in terms of the perception that residents have about what the biggest problem was. And you see much lower on the list, public health, which had risen almost to the top during the pandemic, dropped all the way from 13% with COVID still in play in 2021, all the way to 4% near the bottom of the possible answer set in 2024. And here's the demographic crosstabs that add a lot of richness to the answers for all these questions. And here you see age cohorts across the top. And you see pretty interestingly that every age cohort, with the exception of 65 plus, had the economy as their number one biggest problem. But for that 65 cohort, crime was the biggest problem by about 1 percentage point. And that's been the case every year that we've administered the survey. And it's not surprising to many of us that observe this data. Crime is perceptually a much bigger problem for 65 plus than for the rest of the population. You can see that transportation is a much bigger problem for younger cohorts than it is for other age cohorts. So that interesting splits by age group and by race ethnicity. These aren't too surprising either, that age and that race groups, such as the white race group, tended to rate the economy as the highest problem compared to other issues that are more clear and present for other race and ethnic groups, such as transportation being a greater challenge for the Latino community that has a greater use of our limited mass transit system. You see there at 13%, with transportation as the number one problem. And the African American community that still has slightly higher crime rates than other race and ethnicities were obviously slightly more likely to rate crime as the number one problem than the other race ethnic groups. It's fascinating to look at this and try to hypothesize about the why. I would like to stop for a minute and say that because this is just a 20 question survey, we have very little information and always have had very little information on the why. Have to theorize about the why. Sometimes it's a lot more obvious to get to a hypothesis than with other questions. Here's that finance question. And you can see on the far left, we look at all respondents and see that the plurality are saying that things are worse this year than they were last year. Things are more likely to be adjudged worse in more wealthy areas. If you look at Forsyth County, you see a huge gap, for instance, almost twice the share saying things are worse in 2024 than 2023. Correspondingly, if you look at the city of Atlanta, you see a larger share of respondents saying things are better in 2024 than they were in 2023. As a whole, the core counties are much more likely to be positive about their financial situation than the suburban, exurban counties. Very interesting pattern that holds out in the other questions that we'll look at. And here is an example of the same sort of spatial dichotomy. Latino and Black populations, which, on the whole, statistically speaking, have more of a income challenge, have more of an employment challenge than the white population. They're much more optimistic. They're much more positive about their finances in 2024 than 2023. Again, that somewhat unexpected pattern that honestly is obviously, at least to me, qualify it, to me, influenced by the preponderance of political affiliation. I'll just say that straight out. That is a very explicative variable to me for this difference in results. Ease of finding a job. Again, we see an interesting pattern in that areas like Clayton and Rockdale that have a higher unemployment rate and that really always have had a higher unemployment rate than areas like Forsyth and Cherokee at the bottom of the chart, they were more likely to say it was a good time to find a job in 2024 than those suburban communities like Forsyth and Cherokee. Well under half of people in Forsyth and Cherokee said it was a bad, well under half said it was a good time. Whereas in Clayton and Rockdale, significantly over half said it was a good time to find a job. And that pattern is just very interesting in that it just is not really supported by the available data at a in a broad population sense. We also do these splits by race and by all those other demographic crosstabs that I mentioned. This view is from a really terrific tool called our Metropolitan Atlanta Speaks dashboard, data dashboard. I'm going to put a link to that in the chat for you after our presentation finishes. And that's a terrific way to look at these crosstabs, the crosstabs that are interesting to you. And we see here that really interesting split more explicitly by race. And you see here that the white population is more likely in a share basis to see 2024 as a bad time to find a job compared to the Black population, which is not an intuitive result. It's a little bit more intuitive by age, however, because we all know in the workforce area the relative struggles that younger members of the labor force have in finding a job as opposed to the core labor force. It is interesting to me that so relatively few of the 65 plus population, perhaps because, jobs aren't clear and present in their mentality to begin with, the lowest share of them see it as a bad time to find a job compared to the other age cohorts. Here's that infrastructure question. And we didn't get the results we were hoping for here because given the exposure that the infrastructure issues, particularly in the realm of water and sewer, had in our region in 2024, we expected more people to be willing to add to their water bill to invest in improving that infrastructure to where we didn't have, significant breaks and significant downtime for our water systems in areas like the city of Atlanta. Now, we did have relatively higher shares in the core county seeming to be willing or strongly agreeing that they would pay more for those upgrades. And yet it's still below 50% for every jurisdiction other than the Cobb County jurisdiction in terms of those that would agree or strongly agree they'd pay more for an infrastructure upgrade. We were hoping, at least intuitively, I thought we'd get at least in the 60 to 65% range, and we did not. Split that by age, more likely to see willingness in the younger cohorts than the older cohorts. not too surprising there. By educational attainment, the more education you had, the larger and the longer those green bars are, strongly agreeing or agreeing that you'd pay more. That's not a particularly surprising result. Looking quickly at transportation, that's the blue bar that you see starting off at the top, running all the way from 2016 through to the pandemic. Much more of a big problem in assessment by our respondents than any other answer option. Dropped off dramatically during the pandemic with all the work from home implementation that happened then, and hasn't come back all that much. Again, this view is from our dashboard, and that link's going to be available to you shortly. Another way of looking at it is this really cool table that I'm not going to dwell on, an immense amount of data here, but you'll see in the transportation lines just how large that share was. Well over a fourth in some years for transportation is the biggest problem, all the way from 2013 through to 2019, and dropping off to about 1 in 10 since then. The perceived need for transportation, this is not as high a share as you would think, under 40% in every one of our jurisdictions that we surveyed strongly agreed or agreed that they frequently lack transportation to get to the places that they needed to go. Conceptually, of course, we say we love public transit. It's very important or somewhat important, approaching 95% across all respondents, and pretty consistent across all counties, even suburban counties, in the share that say this is an important thing to our regional economy, to our future. But we really don't want to pay for it. The plurality does not anyway. The plurality disagrees or disagrees strongly that they'd pay more in taxes to fund that rail and bus expansion. And you only get a higher share agreeing or strongly agreeing with more taxes for that in DeKalb County, in the city of Atlanta, very close in Clayton and Cobb, but in the suburbs where there's lower use, lower clear and present exposure to those systems, not much interest in more taxes. Here's another view of that where you see under 50% for every jurisdiction, strongly agreeing or agreeing, even the core areas that have a relatively robust system like City of Atlanta, Fulton, and DeKalb. To go into the artificial intelligence issue, this was a new question this year. I was a little bit surprised by this one because people were not as optimistic as I thought they might be. You see here with the yellow bars, the share that saw AI as having a mostly negative effect going forward into the future. And every single jurisdiction had a plurality of respondents saying that AI was going to have a mostly negative impact. Relatively more optimism in core areas than in suburban areas. But still, as you see there, in every instance, that yellow bar outstrips the green bar, where you had a judgment of a mostly positive effect for AI. Splitting that by age, not surprising here that the older cohorts, those less tech savvy, those more leery of giving over control of their life to unknown sources, were much less optimistic about AI than the younger cohorts that have already done that to a significant extent with our smartphones and such. But still, even in those younger cohorts, a plurality seeing it as having a mostly negative effect. So, given the significance of AI that's obvious to all of us, particularly in the workforce space, moving forward, we have to try to put policies in place that control it to an extent that we as a society can take advantage of the power of AI. Because out there right now, there's not too much optimism about it. This is my women are smarter slide, because it's clear here that women are more leery of the influence of this new technology that has vast downsides, I think we all would admit, whereas men are more eager to embrace it as having a more positive effect. And now we'll finish up with a look at the future. I'm still under 30 minutes, so I'll finish up with this. Again, this is where we have gotten, other than the biggest problem, the most media exposure for this question, and really the most influence that we've had on framing some of ARC's policies. Is this a good time to introduce things? Is this a good time to revisit particular policy initiatives that we have? Things are slightly better, as I indicated, this year than they were last year. However, we're still not getting the height that we got in 2016. If you look at that orange bar, that gives you the share of respondents thinking things are going to be better across the region in the next 3 to 4 years than worse. And you see that still this past year and every year since 2020, you know, perhaps immediately going to 2021, not surprisingly, but we have not recovered in terms of the share of better being higher than the share of worse. Looking at that by jurisdiction level, you can see that no jurisdiction outstrips 40% of its population thinking things are going to be better in the next 3 to 4 years. But this slide is ordered from the highest shares thinking things are going to be better to the lowest shares thinking things are going to be better. And you see that spatial pattern that I've mentioned before crop up right here as well. In areas that overall have less economic advantage, that have more employment challenges, that have higher relatively crime rates, you see more optimism about the future than in areas with the reverse, with those higher incomes, with those lower poverty rates, like a Cherokee and a Forsyth County. Less optimism about the near-term future. If you look at it by race, again, that pattern, more optimism about the short-term future in demographics that don't right now have the greater socioeconomic advantage. Now, here are those questions in the news, and these were questions that we inserted just this year for reasons that I'll go through. For the last couple of years, Atlanta has continued to add to its population growth, as well as actually for the last 50 years, but it's been exposed more in the media lately as a negative. In fact, this headline, the "We Full" headline, has been very prominent in the AJC in the last 3 to 4 years of coverage of this issue. They even got a little logo there, "We Full" with the peach. So there's the perception out there that a lot of our residents don't really want any more population growth. And so we ask this question: do you think that population growth, being a leader, is critical for our region's economy? And we were stunned to see, given the media coverage, that a plurality, well, a majority actually, if you look at the green bars here, a majority in every single jurisdiction strongly agreed that leading in population growth was critical for our region's economy. So clearly, at least the way we asked this question, people did not agree with the AJC, and we are not full. In fact, we want more people for a stronger economy. We want the vibrancy that that population inflow would produce. Now, we weren't able to drill into, do you want the growth somewhere else other than in your community, which I think we'd all agree is probably the likely answer. So maybe we'll have to be able to explore that a little further in the future with the nuance to that question. Also, we've all seen in the media the legitimate and validatable issue that we have less medical access in areas to the south of I-20, in areas that are losing hospitals, in areas that don't have the transportation infrastructure to enable that access. These are some headlines dealing with that issue. So we expected, when we asked about, if I call 911 because of an illness or injury, will the ambulance arrive in a timely fashion? We expected larger shares across all jurisdictions to disagree or strongly disagree that they would expect that timely medical response. And as you see here, with the green and the gray bars, a larger than 50% share in every single jurisdiction thought that they would get timely access from an ambulance if they called 911. This again surprised us. It was a explicable or understandable spatial pattern now, in that the suburban areas with more access to good transportation, with more access to medical facilities, with no closure of their medical facilities, the spatial breakdown is more explicable here, in that Fulton, City of Atlanta, and DeKalb are at the bottom of the chart in terms of the share thinking they'd get a timely response. And yet still, for those jurisdictions, you have over a 50% that indicated that they would get a timely response. So let me finish with what's next for MAS. We've done this now for 11 years. Um, we are going to prepare. We've got budgeted 170,000, which is slightly up on an inflationary aspect from the amount we spent for the survey in 2024. And we are preparing now, again, with the Kennesaw State Burris Institute that we've worked with for 11 out of now the 12 years that we've done this survey, to do one in August of this year. We're developing the contract. We're looking at questions. As will surprise no one on this call, we're probably going to need to, for obvious circumspect reasons, not ask about EVs and climate change this year. So we will have room to maybe bring back some questions about the workforce environment, to maybe bring back some questions about housing affordability that we dropped off in favor of exploring those EV climate change issues before. So I'll bring that back at the very end here. So we're going to be doing pre-tests and on any new questions if necessary. We try to select questions that have already been asked in national surveys so that we're comfortable with the wording going in and don't have to go to that expense of a pre-test. And we'll be doing the survey in August across the whole month. And we get data back around Labor Day and start charting it up in preparation for targeting headline release, as many of you may know, by the State of the Region Breakfast, which is the end of October, the beginning of November every year. And it's where we really roll out headlines and detailed information on our website. And then we will do analysis through the next year, through the middle of next year, as we have done this year as well. And I'll give you a link to access some of that additional research in a moment. Now, the future, unsure that it'll be funded going forward into 2026. We have, as an agency, explored over the last 5 years or so the financial viability of doing something like building a panel survey to replace Metro Atlanta Speaks, to allow us more flexibility in getting at the why people are answering the way that they're answering. But as many of you may know, it's so expensive to build out that panel, the richness of the representation, to get an ability to do these surveys multiple times during a year, to get the ability to break out our targeted universe into groups interested in housing, groups interested in transportation, that would answer enough questions to allow us some insight as to the why for some of these issues. So probably if we as ARC move forward with a regional survey, it will be something along the lines of Metro Atlanta Speaks in the future, and we'll know in the next couple of months whether that will be the case. And here to close are some links to get additional information on MAS. This link to the left will get you to our main page, which looks a little different than this image I'm just seeing, but gives you pretty ready access to a Metro Atlanta Speaks webpage that gives you links to many more slides that present data on various questions that I didn't get to cover today that are part of the question set for MAS. This is our blog here to the right. And again, you'll get these links in the chat. We have a Metro Atlanta Speaks tab on this blog that delves into specific topics like senior sentiments coming out of the survey, like the race ethnic splits that we addressed in the slides that I just went through. So that's a great resource. And also there's some limited data for Metro Atlanta Speaks available in our Data Nexus tool, which if you haven't looked at, I encourage you to. It's one of the most robust ways to very quickly generate maps with American Community Survey data at a tract level for our region. So I'll close with that and open it up to questions. And again, this is just the very, believe it or not, as long as I droned on, this is just the tip of the iceberg for Metropolitan Atlanta Speaks. There's much more. Ask me at that email in the middle if you want more information or you have specific topics you might want to explore. So thanks. Joy?
Yes, Jim, thank you so very much. Really appreciate you sharing the latest results for Metro Atlanta Speaks. And just to level set with our attendees joining us this morning, the survey results that you just presented were collected in August of 2024. Is
Right.
that correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly
So it's
so.
for, so that's the time
Pre-election.
that's captured,
Yep.
right? And
Very
then
important
it's,
to
you're
remember.
comparing it to previous years that were, where those results were collected during previous similar
Right.
timeframes, like the
It's
previous
always been
August,
August. Yep. So it is
August.
a year
Okay.
over year, August to August, which will have
August to
another
August.
data point coming up this summer.
With August
Yeah.
2025. Okay.
Yeah.
And then just roughly, about how many folks participate in the survey? You may have said that's at the beginning and I missed
I
it, but
did not actually. Thank you for bringing
okay.
it up. It's
Okay.
4,100. So it's a big
Okay.
survey across the
That's a
region.
big
And we
survey.
target for each of our jurisdictions, we targeted at least 400 survey responses. And that's the difficulty in terms of the cost, because that gets
Right.
very difficult, particularly with a phone sample for suburban counties. But we do that so we can say at a county level that we have representative results. We've got enough of the
Gotcha.
sample to be able to do that.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, well, still over 4,000
Yeah,
results is a
big
pretty,
survey.
that's a definitely, and that's the largest of any sort of survey
It's
collection,
it's the
right?
largest
Okay.
that I know of,
Yeah.
other than, a federal longitudinal survey.
Sure.
Those are
Yeah.
bigger, of course, but again, we're spending, over $150,000 every year now for the last 8 or so to get a set of data that at the demographic crosstab at the regional level, you can kind of take it to the bank if you see more than a 5 percentage point or so difference in any question. You can be pretty confident that's a real difference, not just a mathematical vagary, but a real difference in terms of the representation that we've managed to get from a sample that big.
Yeah, no, and thank you all for putting that level of effort to help us really understand where our neighbors are and what they're thinking. So just looking at the past year, what surprised you most? You kind of alluded to some of this in your presentation, but
Yeah.
if you wouldn't mind touching
I
on that
mean,
again.
definitely for me. I mean, one issue was certainly the fact that we didn't, and this is perhaps can go down to politics to a certain extent. We know that the uptake of EVs has increased over the past couple of years, but we got no increase in the surveyed population. We know that there have been extreme weather events that have certainly, should have raised up the climate change issue in front of everyone's mind a bit more in 2024 than 2023. And yet we got slight declines in our response set that saw global and local climate change as a driving concern for our region. That surprised me. The spatial differences that I talked about throughout most of the questions I dealt with have always surprised me. And it doesn't tend to surprise a lot of people that hear about the results as much as it tends to surprise me, in that there's just a uh, almost inexplicable lack of optimism about some things in our communities that are more advantaged economically, that are less disadvantaged in terms of transportation access, in terms of job availability and accessibility. And again, that's it's an opportunity and a challenge, so to speak, in that we do need to, as a region, convey the fact that we need to obviously invest in those areas to, get more to equality, to get more to an even playing field, and to close the gap in that spatial discrepancy that we're seeing. You're
You have
muted.
the data that,
Okay, there you go. There you go.
oh, okay.
You're back. Yeah,
Thank
you're
you.
back.
Gotcha. And it's good that the data, because you're doing this on an annual basis, so you can
Yeah,
kind of track those changes.
yeah,
I guess I was surprised because you did mention the sort of the differences, and when you think of the core areas, which
yeah,
are what the city of Atlanta, Fulton,
yeah.
DeKalb
Fulton,
counties, right?
DeKalb,
And that
Clayton.
there's a difference in optimism
Yeah,
among in those counties versus the suburban counties and
yeah.
exurban, and so there's less optimism generally in those exurban suburban counties. That's always surprising to hear.
Yes, it,
Uh,
it
um,
continues to surprise us. Yeah. Um,
yeah, yeah,
and it's particularly surprising to see, to me, the job question was very surprising. And perhaps it's because, um, we got a greater share of actual unweighted responses for older population in the suburbs than we did in the core areas. That probably has some influence on the response sets there that said it was a worse time to find a job. Because obviously it is more difficult to find a job in many areas of the core counties because of access, because
Right,
of educational background to attain that job. It's obviously more difficult than it might be in
right,
suburban areas, and yet those weren't the responses that we got. That that I think was the strangest phenomenon
right,
coming out
right.
in that spatial differential. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe like you just pointed out, maybe it has something to do with the age demographics as
Yeah,
well.
something. But I mean, we did try
Yeah,
to wait for that, but there's
yeah,
only,
yeah.
as anybody that's familiar with surveys know, there's only so much waiting you can do. And
Right, right.
there's only so much you can, because you're still dealing when you wait, you're still dealing with certain population groupings with a smaller number of instances that you wait. So
Yeah, yeah,
your data is going to be slightly less accurate for the demographics you get less responses for. Just no way around it.
right.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned that there was higher optimism even among the suburban counties, like in Clayton and Rockdale versus, say,
Yep.
Cherokee and Forsyth,
Yep.
which also is, you mentioned, being surprised by that. And that is,
Yeah.
that's where it's, it'd be interesting to peel back that onion layer to try to figure out
Yeah.
why that's the
Yeah.
case.
Absolutely. So, I
That's
mean, we
yeah,
love to be able to drill down to where we would get representative results for, say, the racial breakdowns within a county,
mhm,
the age breakdowns within a county, but that would be a whole nother level of surveying that we would need a panel to get at.
right,
And it is very difficult for me to see the investment being there unless this survey ultimately gets a partnership with the university, a direct partnership with the university or a direct corporate partnership to get that sort of financial and intellectual backing behind it. And that's actually always been the dream, the long-term dream for a survey like this. But until then, it's going to be difficult to drill down into that level of detail. And that's really, as I think we all would see, that's really what you need to do to more directly impact local policy, to give local leaders the quote unquote cover that they would need to explore certain policies. We would need to be able to say something to say, pick Gwinnett County. We would need to say your African American population is behind policy X. And we cannot say that with the level of detail we have now.
and we appreciate your always being, taking the cautious approach with the data
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so
Got
forth.
to. Yeah,
Uh,
got to with surveys.
yeah. And I know, I have a couple more questions. If anyone joining us, if you have questions, again, feel free to put it in the chat or Q&A. But you know, Jim, as you've been doing this for 11 years now, are there what changes? You mentioned transportation. You touched on how
Yeah.
that's changed as not being the priority issue anymore. Are there other changes that stick out for you in terms of how our neighbors are thinking about the various critical issues that are affecting everyday life? Are there
Right. Right.
other changes that you've seen?
I mean, obviously, and we all know this from being observers, interested and informed observers of regional issues. Housing, has really come to the fore. And we all know that when we look at the limited supply that we've got, when we look at the more limited supply that we have in entry level housing, people are aware of that and cognizant of that across all groups now. Even if you're wealthy, uh, you're going to say that you don't have the capacity to move easily within your neighborhood. And that's a issue that is getting the right policy focus because everyone is concerned about it. Now, we can't say in any way, shape, or form that that the groups across the spectrum of demographics would want the same policy response to it, but they all realize there has to be a policy response. I think from the preponderance of the results across all the questions, we can say that that's an issue that the region, the vast majority of the region is behind looking at that as something that we need to solve. I mean, the opposite is obviously true about alternate transportation modes, at least from this survey. People see it as something that, yeah, we need it as a region, but I don't need it. My neighbors don't necessarily need it. Somebody else can use it. That's, that's the NIMBY. The NIMBY is more evident in the answers to something like the transit question than it is in answers to the housing question. And that's not to say that I think that suburban counties would want affordable housing as they perceive affordable housing to be built next to them. But they recognize clearly that there needs to be some sort of solution to make their areas more affordable for, service employees, for retail employees that work in those areas. I think that the vast number of questions we've managed to ask consistently over time kind of leads us to that conclusion. That's the most important I can see.
And that's actually a national issue.
Yeah,
It's,
that's
like you
right.
said, it's the service employees, but also the teachers and,
Yep.
public safety
Firemen,
are,
policemen, yeah,
right,
a whole
right,
host of
exactly.
those like occupations. Yeah.
Right, just ensuring that they can attain, decent housing and so forth
Right.
in the
Yeah.
communities that they serve is so critical. And I know you all are through ARC are looking at that as well through the
Yeah.
Metro Atlanta Housing Forum
Housing
that
strategy.
work
Yeah.
that you
And the
do.
forum.
Yeah,
You're right. And for
yeah,
that reason, I really want to circle back this year to focus more questions on that issue to try to get a little bit more information about what people would be interested in seeing, a little
yeah.
bit more cover for pursuing certain policy initiatives in that area, at least regionally speaking. I think we could maybe with some of the question room that we might have from having to de-emphasize certain areas, we might bring back those questions. Only problem is just sharing amongst this group, it's very difficult to frame questions about housing in a coherent way because people look at the issue and such, affordable housing as an issue. What does that mean to different people? How do you ask about it in a way that you can correctly intuit or compensate for what somebody in a suburban county might hear when they hear that answer choice versus somebody in a core county? And how do you filter any answers that you might get for the question through that prism? So yeah, we want to ask much more about housing, but are all the answers that we get going to be compromised by our inability in a phone and online survey to educate people enough about what we really want to ask them about? It's going to be difficult, but necessary to try to do that.
And I know, Jim, you're a member of the Max Data Council, and so you know that
Yeah,
the Data Council could potentially be a vetting source for you to kind of think through some of those questions. And
absolutely. Yeah,
I'm
we've
sure,
actually asked for question
yeah,
insights, and we'll do so again this year. Yeah,
and right, and I'm sure those of us joining us this morning too, if you have any thoughts for Jim with
yeah,
respect to
absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that.
whether it's housing questions you want to see asked or other questions, as he mentioned, they are now getting ready to kind of prepare for the next survey. So,
Yep.
we'll make sure you have Jim's contact
Hmm.
information with
Yep.
respect to that. The only other thing I'll touch on, and then we'll get ready to close, is the infrastructure question. Folks are
Hmm.
not willing to pay for infrastructure
Yeah.
improvements, and we
Yeah.
have some of the outdated critical infrastructure in the metro
Yeah.
Atlanta area, right? And last year we had a major pipe burst in
Yeah.
Atlanta,
Right.
that
Right.
right?
Yep. Yeah.
So that's the I don't know if there's a question in there for you other than it's just that kind of was. I know you mentioned has mentioned that before, but every time I hear him, it is surprising that
Right.
you
I
know,
think that we see in the answers to that question, that there does need to be more education about just how old and how stressed our infrastructure is in the areas of water, particularly in the areas of transportation. Um, and there needs to be that education. We need to bring back that question during a time, and it's not necessarily this year, when there's a perception that the economy is not as bad as it is. Um, and the economy is not particularly bad across a number of indicators, but the perception is out there that it is. It would be great to be able to ask that question to go back a couple years when the perception was out there that the economy was better and see if people are just really filtering their willingness to pay through an entirely personal prism of gee whiz, I don't have the flexibility in my budget, so I can't do that, even though I think it is important, versus I don't really think it's important to invest in that. How do you get that distinction? That's going to be tricky unless we ask it over a period of time when we can see the results, and the results to other questions inform it a little bit more. And that's why, surveying, if you're not doing a focus group, and you're not doing a focus group with a lot of people in it over time, you are constrained in what you can really draw from it, because so much is influencing, and sussing out what's moving the levers is very hard. Yeah.
While we can't get into the reasons why people answer the questions the way that they answered, the Metro Atlantic Speaks does provide us a really decent snapshot
Yep.
of where folks are,
Yep.
and
Yep.
what they're thinking. And as you pointed out in your presentation, the headlines might say XYZ, but that's not necessarily how people are thinking.
Right.
So thank you so very much for joining us. We
Yep.
appreciate your insights as always.
And I'll drop a few links into the chat right quick before we close.
Okay,
Okay.
awesome. Thank you, Jim.
All
Thank you so
right.
much. And we'll make sure we also send all that out to folks who registered who weren't able to show up live, but as you know, they count on us to share this information and follow up. So we'll do that. Just to wrap up, folks, if you're not already a member of MAX, we would welcome you to join us. MAX is both a workforce development network as well as an association. We have just over 400 folks who are now part of our membership, and we'd love for you to be one if you're not already with us. Here's the QR code that you can use to go ahead and capture the link to register. So feel free to do that. You can also, of course, find it on our website. Upcoming with Max, thank you to our board lead, Daniela Perry with the Georgia Chamber. She has arranged for on April 25th for us to hear from the public policy experts for our annual legislative debrief on what was discussed in the session, uh, and also key policy updates that we may want to be aware of as workforce partners. And then on May 30th, Joseph Santoro, a colleague of Daniela's, will be joining us from the Georgia Transportation Alliance to provide an update to us there. If you haven't yet registered, there's still a little time to register for our Max Talks, which will be next Wednesday, April 2nd. We're going to have breakfast together, and then we'll have a chance to hear from Dr. Glenn Cannon, the president of Gwinnett Tech, and some of his leadership team about their workforce needs. A lot of folks think of Gwinnett Technical College as obviously an institution of higher learning, but they're also one of our larger employers. They, employ over 400 employees in a variety of different positions. And so we'll get to learn more about what their hiring needs are. And then we're going to actually also do a tour of their campus. They have some major facilities there that would be cool for all of us to see, like their Mercedes-Benz lab, as well as their new cybersecurity facility. So if you haven't joined or signed up for Max Talks yet, you can find the registration link on our website. And then last but certainly not least, again, a big shout out to all of our anchor investors who join us in this work and make it possible for us to serve you. So thanks to all of you for joining us this morning on this Friday morning. We appreciate you spending time with us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Max engagement.